You are right that we did get progressively more and more pessimistic. I think 2006 was really the low point where we began to say, well, we actually began to question one of our fundamental assumptions, which was that Iraqis were Iraqis first and Shia and Sunni second, and the scale of the sectarian violence got so high that we did begin to put about the civil war. They appeared in a couple of the assessments, and that was a low point. I think, almost as a result of that played into the fact we were a little slow then to pick up in 2007 that things were turning round. In terms of pushback, after William's time, at the end of 2005, we wrote a couple of papers, one on the prospects for the elections, the December elections, where we particularly caused a few waves because we said it would take a long time to form the new government. I think what we actually said was it won't form until well into 2006, and at the time the policy was that the new government had to be formed immediately the elections had been over. It had to be very, very quick. And I did get a degree of pushback then, saying, "What are you doing, saying that this is not to be formed until late in 2006? I think the problem really was that there was a lot of pressure being put on Whitehall as a whole and Number 10, saying we have got to get this up and running very quickly. That's our job. That's our mission." Here was the JIC coming in and saying that ain't going to happen, and there was a bit of concern that people would read the JIC paper and say, "Oh well, we needn't bother." Actually, I think that exaggerates the impact of a JIC paper, but that was one point. Also, consistently we produced these assessments, roughly every 6 months, of the quality of the Iraqi security forces, how rapidly Iraqization was progressing, how effectively, where we were pretty consistently saying this is all going to take longer than you want it to. We got fairly consistent pushback on that from the MOD, and I would say also from people in theatre who were engaged in training up the Iraqis. Their criticisms were, first, that there was a certain element of, how can you in London sit and say this isn't going well? Actually it's going fine. Then there was a second element that said, you're setting your standards too high. We are never going to produce NATO-quality Iraqi forces, but they will be good enough. I think the second point is possibly a valid criticism, although I actually think that our assessments were, if anything, a little over-optimistic. We tended to pull our own. I questioned a couple of times in my end-of-year reviews whether we had pulled our punches by saying they are not going to be ready to operate unaided in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, whereas actually we might have said in 5 years' time. But actually, in the end, when the assessments came back, I think they were accurate. It became particularly sensitive round about the time we were moving into the period of handing over to provincial Iraqi control, because there was a date on which, particularly down in MND Southeast, provinces were supposed to be handed over to Iraqi control. And here was the JIC saying we are really not confident that you are going to have Iraqi security forces in a fit state to take over PIC on the date that you are planning it to be, and I would get a certain feeling at times that that date was going to be met, no matter what the JIC said. So, to put it in the best way, I think, people read the JIC paper and said, okay, that's what the assessment is. We are just going to have to do better and make it happen,